A very rich man marries his new maid, who he found to be unattractive, after making a bet. However, he is shocked by what he discovers on their wedding night. Before we begin, please comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The party at the Montero mansion was in full swing. Arthur Montero, the host of the evening, stood surrounded by his wealthy friends, all engaged in conversations fueled by champagne and inflated egos. Arthur, with his usual air of superiority, commanded. The room's attention was on him as always. Thomas Soriano, known for his sharp tongue and love of provocation, approached with a mocking smile, holding a glass of wine. He looked directly at Arthur. "Arthur, you always say that money can buy and change anything. You think that with the right price, everything in this world can be transformed." Arthur raised an eyebrow, slightly bored. "Isn't it true? Money is the most. That's a powerful tool. There are no limits." Thomas tilted his head, pretending to consider the response. "It's easy to say that here, surrounded by people who only tell you what you want to hear. But can you prove it?" The group around them fell silent, intrigued by the challenge. Arthur set his glass down on a nearby table and crossed his arms. His stance was defiant. "And how exactly do you expect me to prove something that's already obvious?" Thomas stepped closer. A sly grin spread across his face. "I'll bet you $5 million that you can't marry someone outside of your social circle, someone who doesn't fit your standards of beauty or your world. There's more. You must stay married to her for 3 months. Convince the world the marriage is real. Completely transform her." Thomas's laughter echoed through the room, accompanied by a few murmurs and curious glances. The mood in the group shifted immediately. Everyone waited for Arthur's response. He laughed briefly and without humor. "You're not serious," Thomas said. "I'm married to a woman who doesn't meet my standards. I've been married to her for 3 months. That's so ridiculous. It's not even worth answering." Thomas ignored Arthur's initial refusal and casually glanced around the room. He saw Maria carrying a tray of champagne glasses across the room. Her hair was tied back in a simple bun. She wore a spotless black dress, white uniform. Her posture was humble, her eyes downcast as she diligently did her job. Thomas nodded toward her and chuckled. "What about her? Your maid. She's peculiar. Completely outside your type. She's perfect for the challenge." Arthur followed Thomas's gaze and frowned when he recognized Maria. "You've got to be kidding me. Me married to a maid? That's utterly absurd. Even for you. Why not? Why not? If money really does buy everything?" Thomas countered, his smile full of provocation. "This should be easy for you, right? After all, you're the great Arthur Montero. Or are you afraid you'll lose the bet?" The guests around them held their breath, captivated by the rising tension. Arthur kept his gaze locked on Thomas, feeling the challenge strike at his pride. He knew that backing down now would make everyone see him as a coward, something he couldn't allow. Arthur licked his lips, carefully considering his next move. Finally, he picked up his glass. He took a small sip of wine and said, "Deal, 3 months with her. I'll prove to you there's no challenge I can't conquer." The group started talking and laughing. Thomas simply smiled, happy with the idea. He held out his hand. Arthur shook it firmly, agreeing to the terms. This is going to be fun, Thomas said, sounding amused. But remember, you have to make it look real. I want to see her by your side at events, dressed like a high society lady. If you fail, I'll be $5 million richer. Arthur narrowed his eyes. I never fail. Thomas. Get ready to open your wallet. The next morning, Maria was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw Arthur Montero standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on her. Mr. Montero. Do you need something? She asked. With some hesitation. He said, yes. Maria. And moved closer to her. I need to talk to you. It's about a proposal. Maria frowned. Confused. A proposal? Arthur leaned in slightly, being careful with his words. He knew that to convince Maria, he'd need to find the right tone. I want you to marry me. The plate slipped from Maria's hands, crashing into the sink and splashing water everywhere. You heard me right. Arthur spoke calmly, as if they were discussing business. It's a contract. You'll be my wife for 3 months. In return, I'll pay you an amount that could change your life. Maria laughed nervously, as though he were joking. That's not funny. Mr. Montero. I'm not joking. Maria looked at the check Arthur had pulled from his pocket and placed on the counter. The amount was enough to solve any financial problem you've had for years. You're struggling, aren't you? With this money, you can start fresh. What do you say? Maria looked at the check and then back at Arthur. She knew this man was used to controlling everything around him. It was clear he didn't see her as a person, rather as a means to achieve something. Why me? She asked, trying to understand. Because you're perfect for it. Arthur replied bluntly. It's simple. No one would expect me to marry someone like you. That's exactly why it will work. Arthur's honesty made her uncomfortable. Maria wanted to say no and walk away. She couldn't. She had overdue bills and was responsible for her family. What happens after the 3 months? She asked. We get divorced, he answered. Arthur replied bluntly. It's simple. No one would expect me to marry someone like you. That's exactly why it will work. Arthur's brutal honesty made her uncomfortable. Maria wanted to say no and walk away. But the overdue bills and the weight of caring for her family pressed heavily on her heart. And if I agree? What happens after the 3 months? She asked indifferently. We get divorced. You go back to your life. I go back to mine. But you'll be in a much better position than when you started. Maria took a deep breath. She knew entering this arrangement was like selling a part of herself. Maybe it was her only chance to change her reality. I accept, she finally said. Great. Tomorrow. You'll be my. Arthur smiled. Satisfied. Maria felt indifferent. She didn't want to ask questions or argue. She would go back to her life. He would go back to his. He would be in a much better position than when he started. Maria took a deep breath. She knew that entering this arrangement was like selling a part of herself. Maybe it was her only chance to change her reality. I accept, she finally said. Arthur smiled. Satisfied. Great. Tomorrow you'll be my wife. Maria watched him leave the kitchen with a heavy heart. She knew she was stepping into a dangerous game. For the first time in a long while, there was hope that things might change. The next morning began with a different tension at the Montero mansion. The staff whispered in the hallways, puzzled by Arthur's behavior. After all, it was unusual to see him spending so much. Maria watched him leave the kitchen, feeling worried. She knew she was taking a risk. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The next morning, the staff at the Montero mansion felt a different tension. They were confused by Arthur's behavior. He was spending a lot of time at home, especially dressed formally, early in the morning. For Maria, the day had started like any other. She was cleaning, organizing, staying out of sight. She was in the side garden, kneeling as she gathered fallen leaves from one of the old trees. The scent of wet grass mixed with the fragrance of flowers. For a moment, Maria felt a sense of peace. Then, Arthur's shadow interrupted her. Maria was early for work, dressed formally, ready for the day. But she felt uneasy. She had cleaned, organized, stayed invisible. She was in the side garden, kneeling as she gathered fallen leaves from one of the old trees. The scent of wet grass mingled with the fragrance of flowers. For a moment, Maria felt a sense of peace. Then Arthur's shadow interrupted her tranquility. He stood beside her. She stood up quickly, wiping her hands on the edge of her uniform. She didn't realize she was spreading dirt on her apron. Her eyes met Arthur's. She saw something different there, determination and what seemed like expectation. "Mr. Montero," she replied, trying to hide her discomfort. "Everything's ready. We're going to the registry office in an hour." Maria blinked, confused. "Registry office? Are you sure? We need to start soon." Arthur placed his hands in his pockets. His tone was cold and direct. "The documents are ready. You just need to sign." Maria's heart raced. Until now, the proposal had seemed distant. She thought she could still change her mind. But now, with the formality of marriage imminent, everything's ready. "We're going to the registry." It all felt very real. "I need more time," she said hesitantly. Arthur tilted his head, observing her. "You already agreed." "Maria, I'm not used to waiting." She wanted to back out. Memories of her humble home, her younger siblings' tired faces, the mounting debts held her back. Sighing, she nodded. "All right," she said in a low voice. "I'm ready." An hour later, Maria was sitting in the back of Arthur's car. A black limousine that made her feel even more uncomfortable than the situation she was in. The driver drove in silence while Arthur typed messages on his phone. Unaware of her presence, she looked out the window, watching the city rush by. Where she came from, downtown felt like a completely different universe: huge buildings, luxury stores. "Well, everything's ready. We're going to the registry office." Dressed people who never looked around. "We're here," Arthur said suddenly, putting his phone away. The car stopped in front of a discreet but imposing building. Maria got out hesitantly, while Arthur held the door for her. Inside the registry office, 2 lawyers were already waiting, along with a small group of staff who had clearly been instructed not to ask questions. Maria felt sick to her stomach as she picked up the pen to sign the papers. Her hands trembled. She forced herself to stay calm. In just a few minutes, she was officially Mrs. Montero. Arthur shook that. Everything's ready. We're going to the registrar's office. The registrar's hand met Maria's. He smiled at her. Congratulations. We're officially husband and wife now. It's not exactly like that, Maria said quietly. Arthur didn't respond. He simply guided her back to the car, where the silence between them felt even heavier than before. When they arrived at the mansion, Maria noticed something different. The curtains had been replaced. The lighting was softer. A new decoration adorned the main hall. There was something almost theatrical about the atmosphere. As if the entire house was preparing for a grand event. Maria felt calm. This is your room, Arthur said. As if it were obvious. Maria stepped inside and looked around. It's beautiful, she said. Not knowing what else to say. I hope you're satisfied. Remember. You're my wife now. It's important that everyone believes it. Especially the people in my circle. Maria looked at Arthur. He led her upstairs and stopped in front of a door. He opened it, revealing a luxurious bedroom with an enormous bed. Velvet curtains. A closet larger than the house Maria lived in. This will be your room, Arthur said. As if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Maria turned to him, crossing her arms. And what exactly do you expect from me, she asked. Her tone defiant. Arthur raised an eyebrow, surprised by her defiance. He was used to being obeyed without question. Maria didn't seem willing to make things easy. I expect you to play the part, he said firmly. Elegant dresses. Perfect posture. No impulsive behavior. Maria let out a short laugh. Oh. Of course. She said. Because appearances are all that matter here. Aren't they? Arthur frowned but didn't respond. He knew she was right. He wouldn't admit it. You'll have everything you need tomorrow morning. A stylist will come to help you choose the right clothes. Maria sighed, feeling overwhelmed. She didn't want to accept it. She knew she was stuck in this situation. Fine. If that's what you want. I'll do my part. Don't expect me to change who I am. Arthur shrugged. As if it didn't matter. Maria sighed, feeling overwhelmed. She didn't want to accept it. She knew she was trapped in this situation. Fine. If that's what you want. I'll do my part. Don't expect me to change who I am. Arthur shrugged. As if it didn't matter. That's your problem. As long as you stick to the agreement. I don't care who you are. With that, he left the room, leaving Maria alone in the vast, cold space. She sat on the edge of the bed, feeling small and out of place. Tears threatened to fall. She held them back. 3 months. She whispered. Just 3 months. She whispered to herself. Meanwhile, outside, Arthur walked down the stairs with determined steps. His mind was already focused on the next moves in the bedroom. He couldn't quite explain it. There was something about Maria that made him uncomfortable. She wasn't like the others in his life. That bothered him. The game had begun. Neither of them was prepared for the twist the future held. The next morning, Maria woke up to the sound of soft knocks at the door. Before she could respond, an elegant and imposing woman in a perfectly tailored suit entered the room with confident steps. Behind her were 2 assistants. Good morning, Mrs. Montero, the woman said with a professional smile. My name is Clara. I was hired by your husband to help you dress appropriately for upcoming events. Still sitting on the bed? Maria blinked in confusion. Upcoming events, Clara nodded. Beginning to arrange the dresses around the room. Yes. Mr. Montero believes appearance is essential. Especially for someone in your position. That's why he ordered a complete wardrobe for you. Maria. That's ridiculous. Is this really necessary? Clara paused from organizing the dresses and looked directly at Maria. Without losing her cool. With all due respect. Necessary or not. It's what he wants. I suggest you make the most of it. Maria wanted to argue. She decided to be practical. Fine. Let's just get this over with. Clara smiled in approval. Excellent choice. Over the next few hours, Maria was dressed, fitted, styled while the assistants discussed fabrics and styles as if she were a doll. Despite feeling uncomfortable, Maria noticed that while the dresses were expensive, they couldn't entirely hide who she was. Deep down, she knew no outfit could truly make her fit into this world. When she finally descended the stairs, Arthur was sitting in a leather armchair in the main hall while waiting. He looked up from the tablet he was holding and examined her without saying anything. Not bad. He said in a tone that was so indifferent that it made her angry. Thanks, she replied, crossing her arms. Arthur stood up and adjusted his tie, ignoring her sarcasm. We have an event tonight, a dinner with some of my friends. It's important that you're prepared. Maria narrowed her eyes. A dinner? When exactly were you planning to tell me about this? Now. He said. As if the answer were obvious. Maria sighed. Tired of that attitude. Fine. Don't expect me to pretend to be anything other than who I am. Be someone I'm not. Arthur smiled slightly. As long as you don't embarrass me. That's all that matters. The dinner was held at a fancy restaurant known for its exclusive clientele and extravagant decor. When Arthur and Maria arrived, everyone immediately looked at them. While he walked with his Maria had her usual confidence. She followed Thomas, trying to ignore the curious stares at the table. Thomas was already waiting with two other friends who had been part of the bet. As soon as Maria sat down, Thomas gave a sarcastic smile. So this is the famous Mrs. Montero, he said in a mocking tone. Maria felt her face flush with embarrassment. She kept her cool. Yes. That's me, Thomas laughed. Arthur. You've outdone yourself this time. Arthur gave Thomas a cold glare but said nothing. He knew that reacting would only make his friends enjoy it more. Maria, however, decided she wouldn't let Thomas get away with it. Thomas. Do you usually spend so much time judging other people's lives? The question caught Thomas off guard. He choked on his wine while the others chuckled quietly. Arthur looked at Maria. Surprised. Didn't say anything. There was something about her attitude that he couldn't ignore. Your strength and courage. Even in such a hostile environment. The dinner continued with superficial conversations. Maria could tell she was being scrutinized the entire time. Every gesture, every word seemed to be observed by Arthur's friends. She felt like she was on display. She didn't let it show. When they finally left the restaurant, Maria let out a sigh of relief as she got into the car. That was interesting, she said, looking out the window. Arthur leaned forward slightly. His eyes were fixed on her. You handled it well, Maria said, surprised by the compliment. Thanks. I guess, Arthur said. Half he smiled but didn't say anything. He realized he had underestimated Maria. That made him feel uneasy. Over the next few days, Maria started to get used to the routine of the mansion. She still felt out of place. The staff, who had initially looked at her with suspicion, began to respect her for her humility and dedication. Meanwhile, Arthur watched everything from a distance. He was a man used to. He had control over every aspect of his life. He couldn't figure out how Maria did it. One night, while looking over some documents in his office, he heard light footsteps coming up the stairs. He looked up and saw Maria standing at the door with a cup of tea. "You look like you need a break," she said, walking in without asking for permission. Arthur raised an eyebrow, surprised by her boldness. "And you think you can tell me what to do?" Maria shrugged, placing the cup on the desk. "It doesn't hurt to try." Arthur picked up the cup and inhaled the scent of fresh herbs. He said after a moment. Maria sat in one of the office chairs and glanced at the papers scattered across the desk. "You work a lot," he replied curtly. Maria smiled lightly. "Even so. You should rest sometimes." Arthur looked at her, intrigued. There was something about her simplicity that unsettled him. As if she reminded him of something he'd long forgotten. "You're different," he said without thinking. Maria tilted her head, surprised. "Different how?" she asked. "I don't know." Arthur shook his head. Head tried to push the thought away. "Just different." Maria laughed softly. "I guess I'll take that as a compliment." She stood up, ready to leave. Before going, she looked at him one last time. "Good night, Arthur." "Good night, Maria," he replied without looking away. When the door closed, Arthur leaned back in his chair, still holding the teacup. The first time in a long while, he felt oddly at peace, though he couldn't understand why. The next morning, Arthur called Maria to the backyard garden, where an unusual setup awaited. A table was set under the large oak tree, which was filled with books, silverware, crystal glasses, a small notepad. Clara, Maria's stylist, stood with a formal smile. Beside her was an elegant woman with gray hair who radiated authority. Maria narrowed her eyes at the scene as she approached. Arthur turned to her with an impassive tone. "Maria. This is Esther," he said, indicating the woman with gray hair. "She's an etiquette and manner specialist. Over the next few weeks, you'll have daily lessons to learn how to behave according to your new position." Maria frowned. "Etiquette lessons? Are you serious?" "I'm completely serious," Arthur said, crossing his arms and looking at her as if daring her to refuse. "You need to know how to behave at the events I attend. We can't leave anything to chance." Maria let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Of course. Nothing is more important than looking perfect for the people you want to impress. Right?" "Exactly," he replied, ignoring the sarcasm. "Let's begin." Maria knew she was stuck in this arrangement and couldn't simply walk away. That she wasn't going to make things easy for Arthur. She sat down at the table and crossed her arms. "Okay. Teach me how to be perfect," she said. The first lessons were a true test of patience for both of them. Esther, with her perfect posture and almost unshakable calm, Demonstrated how to hold a wine glass properly. Use the correct utensils. Walk gracefully. Maria, on the other hand, deliberately made small mistakes just to see Arthur's reaction. Maria, Esther said, holding back a sigh as Maria accidentally dropped a fork on the floor for the third time. You need to focus. I'm trying, Maria replied with a playful smile. Arthur, watching from a distance, narrowed his eyes. Maria, you know this is necessary. For whom? For you. Because I'm perfectly fine the way I am. Maria glared at him, her gaze challenging. It's necessary for both of us. Arthur said firmly. I don't make bets to lose, Maria scoffed. She picked up the fork again. Despite her rebellious attitude, part of her wanted to show she could learn. Not to please Arthur. To show he couldn't define who she was. As time went on, Maria noticed small changes in her routine. The manners lessons became less annoying as she started learning the basics. But her relationship with Arthur stayed tense. One evening during dinner, Arthur watched Maria closely as she ate, clearly waiting for her to make a mistake. She knew he was watching. She put her fork and knife on her plate perfectly and smiled at him. Are you satisfied? She asked, her tone defiant. Arthur gave a half smile. I'll admit you're improving. Well, I'm a dedicated student, Maria replied. A hint of irony in her voice. Despite the teasing tone, something felt different between them that night. For the first time, Arthur seemed to see Maria as more than just her appearance or her challenging attitude. He was starting to realize she was stronger and smarter than he had assumed. The next morning, Arthur took Maria to her first mission in high society, a charity brunch hosted by one of his business partners, Clarice Belmont. Maria-dressed Clara entered the room with Arthur in an elegant blue gown. Everyone looked at her. She felt nervous. She kept her head high. Clarice, a sophisticated and imposing woman, approached them with a polite smile. Arthur, darling, who is this lovely lady? She asked. This is my wife. Maria, Arthur said with a forced smile. Clarice raised her eyebrows in surprise. She quickly controlled her reaction with a cordial handshake. It's a pleasure to meet you. Maria, she said. Arthur never mentioned that he was married. Maria smiled politely. Clarice was just being polite. Maria was enjoying the brunch. The guests were curious about her. They wanted to know how someone like her ended up with a man like Arthur. Maria didn't feel intimidated. She used it as motivation. Let's have some fun with those who only read. Aware that Clarice was just being polite, Maria felt a mix of pride and relief. During brunch, the guests watched her with curiosity, clearly trying to figure out how someone like her ended up with a man like Arthur. Instead of feeling intimidated, she used it as motivation. Let's have some fun with those who only read the comments. The comments said. Type milkshake in the comments. Only those who read this far will understand. Now, let's continue the story. When Clarice asked Maria her thoughts on philanthropy, Maria answered honestly. I think helping others shouldn't be limited to events like this. It's something we can all do in our daily lives. Even in small ways. Her response surprised everyone. Arthur, who was about to say something, stopped and watched. The guests seemed impressed at an interesting perspective. Clarice said, raising her glass of champagne, Arthur, It seems your wife has much to teach us all. Maria felt a mix of pride and relief, for the first time. It seemed like Maria felt proud and relieved. She had done something impressive. Back at the mansion, Arthur stopped in the hallway and turned to Maria. "You were impressive today," he said. "Is that a compliment?" Maria asked. Surprised. "Yes," he said, smiling faintly. "You managed to win people over. Even though you're completely different." Maria had made her own life in an unfamiliar world. Back at the mansion, Arthur stopped in the hallway and turned to Maria. "You were impressive today." Maria raised an eyebrow, surprised by the compliment. "Is that a compliment?" "Yes," he said with a faint smile. "You managed to win people over. Even though you're completely different from them." Maria chuckled, crossing her arms. "Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them." Arthur looked at her for a moment, as if seeing something new. "Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you." Maria glanced away, feeling uneasy at his tone. "Well, I just did what I thought was right." "Keep it up, Maria," he said before walking. Maria laughed, crossing her arms. "Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them." Arthur looked at her for a moment, as if seeing something new. "Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you." Maria glanced away, feeling uneasy at his tone. "Well, I just did what I thought was right." "Keep it up, Maria," he said before walking away. She stood in the hallway, watching him disappear upstairs. The first time, she felt she was starting to understand Arthur. Beneath all the coldness and arrogance, there was something more. Something he hid from everyone, even himself. As the weeks went by, the forced coexistence between Maria and Arthur began to reveal hidden. Maria laughed, crossing her arms. "Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them." Arthur looked at her for a moment, as if seeing something new. "Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you." Maria glanced away, feeling uneasy at his tone. "Well, I just did what I thought was right." "Keep it up, Maria." Layers of both. Despite the constant teasing and power games between them, Arthur couldn't help but notice that Maria seemed to carry an invisible burden. One night, he found her in the mansion's garden, sitting alone on a stone bench. She was holding something in her hands, a small notebook she leafed through absent-mindedly. Maria looked at him strangely. "It's late," Arthur said, appearing in the doorway. Maria jumped when she heard him. She closed the notebook quickly. "I couldn't sleep either," he replied, walking toward her. "What are you reading?" he asked. "It's just something of mine," she answered, looking away. Arthur sensed her discomfort and let the matter drop. His curiosity had. Maria laughed, crossing her arms. "Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them." Arthur looked at her for a moment, as if seeing something new. "Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you." Maria glanced away, feeling uneasy at his tone. "Well, I just did what I thought was right." "Keep it up, Maria," he said before walking away. There was something important about that notebook. He wanted to know what it was. The next day, while Maria was helping in the kitchen, Arthur sat in his office. His thoughts divided between the reports he was reading and the image of her in the garden. He didn't know why. That little notebook intrigued him more. Maria laughed, crossing her arms. Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them. Arthur looked at her for a moment. As if seeing something new. Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you. Maria glanced away. Feeling uneasy at his tone. Well. I just did what I thought was right. Keep it up. Maria. He said before walking out. Shortly after lunch. While Maria was busy downstairs, Arthur went to her room. He hesitated before opening the door. Finally gave in to his curiosity. On the dresser next to a vase of wilted flowers was the notebook. He picked it up carefully. Flipping through the pages. What he found surprised him. Notes, Maria laughed. Crossing her arms. Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them. Arthur looked at her for a moment. As if seeing something new. Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you. Maria glanced away. Feeling uneasy at his tone. Well. I just did what I thought was right. Keep it up. Maria. He said before walking away. Sketches almost like a diary. Some pages contained doodles of flowers and landscapes. While others were filled with bits of text and thoughts. One page in particular caught his attention. There was a drawing of two small children holding hands with a woman. Below it was a note. I promise to protect them. No matter the cost. Maria chuckled. Crossing her arms. Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them. Arthur looked at her for a moment. As if seeing something new. Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you. Maria glanced away. Feeling uneasy at his tone. Well. I just did what I thought was right. Keep it up. Maria. Arthur frowned. Who were those children? He didn't know. During dinner that evening. Arthur couldn't hide his unease. He watched Maria closely. Trying to decipher her. Why are you looking at me like that? She finally asked. Setting her fork down. Do you have siblings? He asked. Ignoring her question. Maria froze for a moment. Quickly regained her composure. Maria laughed. Crossing her arms. Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them. Arthur looked at her for a moment. As if seeing something new. Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you. Maria glanced away. Feeling uneasy at his tone. Well. I just did what I thought was right. Keep it up. Maria. Why do you ask? Just curious. He replied. Revealing nothing. Maria averted her gaze. Clearly uncomfortable. I have two younger brothers. They're you. Don't talk to them. Maria sighed. Placing her fork down. There's not much to say. It's been years since we've been in touch. They live with an aunt in another city. Arthur, he noticed the bitterness in her voice. He didn't press further. He knew there was more to the story. He understood he would need patience to get answers. A few days later. While Maria was out with Clara. Arthur called his trusted assistant. Marcos. A conversation. I want you to find out everything you can about Maria. He said. Handing Maria laughed. Crossing her arms. Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them. Arthur looked at her for a moment. As if seeing something new. Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you. Maria glanced away. Feeling uneasy at his tone. Well. I just did what I thought was right. Keep it up. Maria. He said before walking away. Anything specific? Mr. Montero, Marcos asked. Curious. Family. Past anything she might be hiding. Arthur avoided looking at his assistant, feeling a pang of guilt for what he was doing. Understood. I'll report back soon. The next morning, Arthur received a report from Marcos. It was a complete dossier on Maria. He read it and Maria felt a laugh rise in her throat. Maybe because I'm not trying to be like them. Arthur looked at her for a moment, as if seeing something new. Maybe that's what makes them so intrigued by you. Maria glanced away, feeling uneasy at his tone. Well, I just did what I thought was right. Keep it up. Maria. Silence. Maria had grown up in a humble neighborhood, taking care of her two younger brothers from a young age. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was only 17, leaving her as the sole caretaker of the children. A few years. She worked 2 jobs to support them. Eventually lost custody. She couldn't provide a stable home. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest as he imagined Maria facing all that alone. He had never stopped to consider that she might have endured such hardships. Among the documents was an old photo of Maria and her brothers. She looked so young and full of hope, holding the children in the picture. Because she couldn't provide a stable home. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest as he imagined Maria facing all that alone. He had never stopped to consider that she might have endured such hardships. Among the documents was an old photo of Maria and her brothers. She looked so young and full of hope, holding the children in her arms. That night, Arthur found Maria again in the garden, sitting on the same bench where he had seen her before. This time he approached more cautiously and sat down beside her. I need to ask you something, he said directly. Maria looked at him warily. What is it now? Why have you never mentioned your family? Maria pressed her lips together. Arthur found Maria in the garden. It was the same bench where they had sat before. This time, he was more cautious. He sat down next to her. I need to ask you something, he said. Maria looked at him warily. Why haven't you mentioned your family? What do you mean? I don't see how that's any of your business. Maybe it's not, he replied, his tone softer. But I read about what happened. Maria's eyes widened. You read what? Read, she said. What did you do? I needed to know who you really are. Arthur sighed. And now I do. She stood up abruptly, crossing her arms. Do you think you can just together? Surprised by the question. I don't see how that's any of your business. Maybe it's not, he replied, his tone softer. But I read about what happened. Maria's eyes widened. You read what? I needed to know who you really are. And now I do. She stood up abruptly, crossing her arms. Do you think you can just invade my life like this? My story isn't some game for you to explore. I'm not playing, Arthur said, standing as well. I just wanted to understand why you're so guarded. Closed off. And now I do. You fought alone for so long that you believe you can't trust anyone. Maria shook her head, tears threatening to fall. You don't. You've invaded my life like this before. This is the first time it's felt like a game to you. Like it's your property to explore. I'm not playing Maria, Arthur said, standing as well. I just wanted to understand why you're so guarded and closed off. And now I do. You fought alone for so long that you believe you can't trust anyone. Maria shook her head, tears threatening to fall. You don't know anything about me. I know you lost everything, he said firmly. And yet you never gave up. That's more than I can say about most people I know. Maria stood silent, staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. But I want you to know that. At least while you're here. You're not alone, Arthur continued. Maria looked at him. Do you know anything about me? I know you lost everything. That's more than I can say about most people I know. Maria stood in silence, staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. But I want you to know that. While you're here. You're not alone. Maria looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. The first time. She saw something genuine in Arthur. Something that made her reconsider her opinion of him. Thank you, she said finally, before heading back into the mansion. Arthur stayed there for a while, gazing at the starry sky. The first time in years. He felt he might be beginning to understand the true value of the people around you. The night was particularly cold. The Montero mansion felt quieter than usual. Maria, sitting in her room, looked out the window, watching the city lights in the distance. Though surrounded by luxury, she felt lonelier than ever. Her conversation with Arthur about her past still. I know I pressured you into this arrangement. He began, his voice lower than usual. I know I can't change what happened. Echoed in her mind, she thought. She was about to turn off the lights when she heard a soft knock at the door. Confused, she stood and opened it to find Arthur standing there with an unreadable expression. Sorry to bother you so late. He began hesitantly. But I need to talk. Maria raised an eyebrow. Arthur never showed hesitation. Seeing this side of him was surprising. Do you know anything about me? I know you lost everything. That's more than I can say about most people I know. Maria stood silently, staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. Arthur, I want you to know that. While you're here. You're not alone. What about us? And this situation? I'm intrigued. She stepped aside, letting him in. Arthur walked into the room, pacing as if trying to gather his thoughts. Finally, he turned to her, crossing his arms. I know I pressured you into this arrangement. And I know His voice was lower than usual. I know you lost everything. I know you lost everything. He repeated firmly. But you never gave up. That's more than I can say for most people I know. Maria stood silently, staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. But I want you to know that. At least while you're here. You're not alone. Maria looked at him. I haven't exactly been kind. Is this an apology? Arthur gave a crooked smile. Maybe it is. I'm not very good at this. Why are you saying this now? Because I've realized you deserve more than what I've offered so far. I know. Look directly at me. Do you know anything about me? I know you lost everything. That's more than I can say about most people I know. Maria stood silent, staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. But I want you to know that. While you're here. You're not alone. Maria looked at him. At her. Maria was silent for a few moments, processing his words. It was the first time Arthur seemed truly vulnerable. I never asked for anything. Arthur. I just agreed to the terms of your game. But I also know you deserve respect. That's something I've failed to give you. Do you know anything about me? He asked firmly. I know you lost everything. That's more than I can say about most people I know. Maria said, staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. Arthur continued. But I want you to know that. While you're here, you're not alone. Maria looked at him. His sincerity shook something inside her. She felt her anger and resentment begin to fade. Though she wasn't ready to forgive him entirely. Respect is a good start, she said finally. I'm relieved. Arthur said. Can I stay here for a while? If you promise not to criticize my simple furniture. I suppose you can. A touch of. Do you know anything about me? He asked. His tone firm. I know you lost everything. Yet you never gave up. That's more than I can say for most people I know. Maria stood silent. Staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. Arthur continued. But I want you to know that. At least while you're here. You're not alone. Maria looked at him. Her face expressing humor and a genuine smile. As the night wore on, the two found themselves sitting on the floor, sharing a bottle of wine Maria had stashed in a drawer. Their conversation flowed naturally, surprising them both. Arthur opened up about his childhood. Something he rarely did. He spoke about the pressures of growing up in, do you know anything about me? I know you lost everything. That's more than I can say about most people I know. Maria stood silently, staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. But I want you to know that. While you're here, you're not alone. A wealthy family where emotions were seen as weaknesses and results were all that mattered. My mother always said love was a distraction. He said, swirling the wine in his glass. She said relationships are like business deals. You go into them expecting a return. Maria. Be so quick to judge me. He said with a tired smile. I know I'm a. Do you know anything about me? I know you lost everything. That's more than I can say about most people I know. Maria stood silently, staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. Arthur. I want you to know that while you're here. You're not alone. I'm a product of this environment. Sometimes I wonder how things might have been different. Maria. I'm trying to imagine what was behind that cold, controlled facade. You can still change. Arthur. You think so? I'm genuinely curious. I think anyone can change if they want to. You're right. Arthur. What do you know about me? I know you lost everything. That's more than I can say about most people I know. Maria. What's going through your mind? I'm just staring at the ground. I know I can't change what happened. Arthur. I want you to know that. While you're here, you're not alone. Maria. What about you? What would you change if you could? Maria. You were silent for a few moments. I wish I'd been stronger in the past. Maybe my brothers would still be with me if I had fought harder. Maria. You did everything you could. You can't blame yourself for that. That's easy for you to say. Looking down. Arthur leaned forward and looked her in the eyes. You're the strongest person I know. If no one's ever told you that before. I'm telling you now. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. She stopped them from falling. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, "Thank you, Arthur." In the days that followed, their relationship began to change subtly. Though they still exchanged playful remarks. There was now a layer of understanding and respect between them. One afternoon, Maria was in the garden tending to the flowers when Arthur approached her with. He looked relaxed and said, "I need your help." Maria turned and looked surprised. "I need help with something. I have an important meeting tonight. I think it would be good if you came with me." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you want me to attend a business meeting with you?" Arthur nodded. "You're my wife. Remember?" Maria laughed. "I thought that was just to fool your friends." "Maybe," he said with a slight smile. "But I think your perspective could be valuable." She paused, considering the situation. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said. "But don't expect me to sit there quietly." Like some accessory, he replied with a playful look in his eyes. That evening, they arrived at the meeting together. Once again, Maria felt everyone looking at her. Instead of feeling nervous, she stood up for herself, supported by Arthur's presence. When one of the investors started to question the ethical values of a new project, Maria surprised everyone by speaking up. "With all due respect, I don't think profit and ethics have to be opposites. It's possible to achieve financial success without compromising your values." The room fell silent. Everyone looked at her. Arthur, standing beside her, couldn't hide his proud smile. The meeting leader, an elderly man in a perfect suit, nodded slowly. "An interesting perspective, Mrs. Montero. I'd like to hear more." Arthur looked at Maria with admiration, once again realizing how different she was from anyone he had ever known. Back at the mansion, Maria was exhausted but satisfied. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed on the living room floor. Sofa. Arthur came in shortly after, with his hands in his pockets. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "You were incredible tonight." "Thank you," she said, smiling tiredly. "I'm not just saying that to flatter you," he continued. "I truly think you have something special." "Maria." She looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "Arthur. What's happening to you?" He laughed, sitting next to her. "Maybe you're." Maria smiled slightly when she changed. She didn't say anything. Deep down, she knew something was changing between them. She wasn't sure what it meant. The week went by quickly. Arthur decided it was time to introduce Maria to the most exclusive group of people in society, the famous annual Elite Ball. A fancy event attended by the country's most powerful people. Maria, however, didn't share his excitement. When Arthur first mentioned the event, she almost dropped her coffee cup. "What do you mean? A ball?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. "It's an important event," Arthur explained calmly. "And now, as my wife, you'll be the center of attention." Maria huffed, crossing her arms. "Arthur, I can barely handle formal dinners. Do you really think I'll feel comfortable in a place full of people judging every information about me?" He shrugged. "You've already shown that you can deal with tough situations. It won't be as bad as you think." Maria narrowed her eyes. "Easy for you to say. You were born into this world. I'm going to be targeted there. You know it." Arthur sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Yes. They'll judge you. You don't have to care about that. You're not there to please them." "Then why am I going?" She asked. "Because it matters to me." Arthur replied sincerely. Maria didn't say anything for a few moments. She realized that this was the first time Arthur wasn't forcing or demanding. He was asking. "All right," she finally said. "But if anyone insults me, I'm going to respond." Arthur smiled slightly. "That's all I expect from you." On the day of the ball, Clara and her team arrived early to prepare Maria. The mansion was changed into a makeshift workshop. With fabric, jewelry, makeup artists everywhere. Maria looked clearly uncomfortable as the team adjusted the long, elegant silver dress with shimmering details on her. She glanced at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. "You look stunning," Clara said, adjusting the hem of the dress. Maria gave a shy smile. "I don't know. It doesn't feel like me." Clara took her hands gently. "You may be wearing something different. You're still you. Don't forget that." Maria nodded, taking a deep breath. She needed all the courage she could muster to face what lay ahead. When she descended the stairs, Arthur was waiting in the grand entry hall, dressed in a perfect tuxedo. As he saw her, he stopped. He looked at her and said, "You look breathtaking." His tone was more honest than formal. She blushed slightly and glanced away. "Thank you," she said. "You don't look so bad yourself." Arthur offered his arm. She took it. She felt like she was stepping into uncharted territory. The ballroom where the ball was held was a spectacle in itself. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, illuminating the tables. The room was filled with exotic flowers and golden candelabras. A live orchestra played an elegant melody. As soon as Maria and Arthur entered, everyone looked at them. There were whispers, glances, even a few stifled laughs. Maria felt nervous. She kept her head held high, remembering Arthur's advice. Adorned with exotic flowers and golden candelabras, a live orchestra filled the room with an elegant melody. As soon as Maria and Arthur entered, all eyes turned toward them. There were whispers, evaluations, even a few stifled laughs. Maria felt uneasy. She kept her head held high, remembering Arthur's advice. "They're all staring at me," she whispered, leaning toward Arthur. "Let them stare," he replied calmly. "They've got nothing better to do." Maria gave a faint smile, appreciating his support. The evening began with formal introductions. Arthur guided her from one group to another, presenting Maria as his wife. Some were polite but distant. "They're all staring at me," she whispered, leaning toward Arthur. "Let them stare," he replied calmly. "They've got nothing better to do." Maria gave a faint smile, appreciating his support. The evening began with formal introductions. Arthur guided her from one group to another, presenting Maria as his wife. Some were polite but distant, while others were openly condescending. One woman in particular, Vanessa Belmont, stood out. Tall, blonde, strikingly beautiful. She radiated an air of superiority. Vanessa approached Arthur with a charming smile, entirely ignoring Maria. "Arthur, darling, it's so good to see you," Vanessa said lightly, placing a hand on his arm. "And who?" While others were openly rude. One woman in particular, Vanessa Belmont, stood out. Tall, blonde, strikingly beautiful. She acted like she was better than everyone else. Vanessa approached Arthur with a charming smile, completely ignoring Maria. "Arthur. Darling. It's so good to see you," Vanessa said lightly, placing a hand on his arm. "And who is this distinguished young lady?" Maria narrowed her eyes. Before she could respond, Arthur stepped in. "Vanessa. This is my wife. Maria." Vanessa raised her eyebrows as if she had heard something absurd, quickly concealed it with a polite handshake. "Ah. Of course. A pleasure to meet you, Maria." "The pleasure is all mine," Maria replied, keeping her cool. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, assessing Maria like a predator sizing up its prey, "You know, Maria. It takes a lot of courage to step into this world, not everyone can handle it." Maria offered a sweet smile. Her eyes were sharp. "Thank you for the advice. That I imagine it must be difficult. Especially for..." Keeping her cool, Vanessa tilted her head slightly, assessing Maria like a predator sizing up its prey. "You know, Maria. It takes a lot of courage to step into this world. Not everyone can handle it." Maria offered a sweet smile. Her eyes were sharp. "Thank you for the advice. I imagine it must be difficult. Especially for those who try too hard." Arthur suppressed a laugh as Vanessa recoiled slightly, visibly unsettled. When the music shifted to a waltz, Arthur extended his hand to Maria. "Shall we dance?" Maria hesitated, glancing around the room. "I'm not very good at this," she said. "Neither am I," he said with a smile. "But let's pretend we are." She took his hand, and they moved to the middle of the ballroom. As they danced, Maria realized that, despite everything, she felt surprisingly at ease with Arthur. "You're doing well," he said, guiding her across the floor. "Maybe that's because you're not stepping on my feet," she teased. Arthur chuckled. For a moment it felt like they were in a world of their own, far from the judgmental stares. Later that night, Maria was resting at a table when one of Arthur's friends, Thomas, approached her. "So, Maria," he began with an ironic smile, "how are you enjoying your role as the perfect wife?" Maria crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. "Quite well," she replied. "Thank you." Thomas laughed, though there was a cruel. Vanessa remained calm. She looked at Maria as if she were a hunted animal. "You know, Maria. It takes a lot of courage to step into this world. Not everyone can handle it." Maria smiled. Her eyes showed she was serious. "Thank you for the advice. I imagine it must be difficult. Especially for..." She hesitated, then added, "I have to admit, you're doing better than I expected. But tell me, how long do you think it will last?" Maria felt anger rising. She kept her composure. "Thomas. What exactly are you trying to prove?" "Me? Nothing," he replied, feigning innocence. "I just find it fascinating how Arthur managed to find someone so unconventional." Keeping her cool, Vanessa tilted her head slightly, assessing Maria like a predator sizing up its prey. "You know, Maria. It takes a lot of courage to step into this world. Not everyone can handle it." Maria offered a sweet smile. Her eyes were sharp. "Thank you for the advice. I imagine it must be difficult. Especially for..." Before Maria could respond, Arthur appeared, placing a firm hand on Thomas's shoulder. That's enough. Thomas. Thomas shrugged, raising his hands in surrender. Relax. Arthur. I'm just having a little fun. Arthur held his stern gaze until Thomas backed off. Then he turned to Maria. Sorry about that, he said. No need to apologize, she replied. I can handle people like him. Arthur looked at her for a moment, admiring her strength. I know you can. When they finally left the ball, Maria felt immediate relief in the car as the city lights passed by the window. She turned to Arthur. Why did you really bring me here? She asked. Because I wanted them to see who you are. He answered. Vanessa tried to stay calm. She looked at Maria closely, like a hunter looking at its prey. You know, Maria, it takes a lot of courage to step into this world. Not everyone can handle it. Maria smiled. Her eyes showed she was serious. Thank you for the advice. I imagine it must be difficult. Especially for. Maria smiled faintly. Didn't say anything. The first time. She felt that Arthur saw her as more than just a pawn in his game. The days after the ball brought a different atmosphere to the Montero mansion. Maria and Arthur began to understand each other in ways neither of them expected. Their newfound Vanessa remained calm. She tilted her head slightly, studying Maria like a predator assessing its prey. You know, Maria, it takes a lot of courage to step into this world. Not everyone can handle it. Maria offered a sweet smile. Her eyes were sharp. Thank you for the advice. I imagine it must be difficult. Especially for. Connection also brought new tensions. As Maria began to lower her defenses, Arthur seemed increasingly troubled by something he wouldn't reveal. Maria noticed it in small gestures, the nights he stayed late at the office. The distant look during dinners and conversations that occasionally ended abruptly when personal topics surfaced. One morning, as she entered the library searching for a book, Maria found Arthur sitting at the desk, staring at a picture frame in his hands. He didn't notice her presence until she cleared her throat. Everything okay? She asked, noticing his melancholic expression. Arthur quickly set the frame back on the desk and tried to, keeping her cool. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, assessing Maria like a predator sizing up its prey. You know, Maria, it takes a lot of courage to step into this world. Not everyone can handle it. Maria offered a sweet smile. Her eyes were sharp. Thank you for the advice. I imagine it must be difficult. Especially for. Yeah. Just memories from the past. Maria approached, curious. She saw that the photo showed a younger couple. Clearly Arthur's parents. Standing next to a boy she assumed was Arthur as a child. The smiles in the photo contrasted with the tense expression he wore now. They look happy, Maria said softly. Arthur sighed. Vanessa tried to stay calm. She looked at Maria closely, like a hunter watching its prey. You know, Maria, it takes a lot of courage to step into this world. Not everyone can handle it. Maria smiled. Her eyes showed she was serious. Thank you for the advice. I imagine it must be difficult. Especially for. He ran a hand through his hair. They seemed happy. The truth is rarely as simple as a photograph. Maria sat in the chair across from him. Do you want to talk about it? Arthur hesitated. He wasn't the type to share feelings or vulnerabilities. Something about Maria invited trust. My father was difficult. He began in a low voice. He believed that the only way to succeed was through complete control of people. Businesses. Even family. My mother just went along with it. She never questioned him. Maria sensed the bitterness in his voice. You grew up in the middle of that. Arthur nodded. He expected me to follow in his footsteps and become a copy of him. A long time. I did exactly that. I convinced myself he was right. I thought the world was a place where only the strongest survived. What about your mother? What did she think? Arthur looked away. As though the answer weighed heavily on him. She always said, family was important to her. In practice. She chose my father and his demands over everything. She never stood up for us. Maria sat silently. Thinking about what he had said. The first time. It felt like she was seeing the real Arthur. The man behind the cold. Confident exterior. Maybe that's why you're so reserved. She said carefully. Arthur gave a dry laugh. Reserved is a generous word. The truth is. I learned not to trust anyone. It's easier that way. Maria leaned forward. Locking eyes with him. But you don't have to live that way. Arthur. You can be different. He looked at her for a moment. As though trying to believe her words. Before he could respond. The mansion's doorbell rang. Breaking the moment. The sound was insistent. As if whoever was outside wouldn't leave until they were answered. Arthur and Maria made their way to the entrance. Where Marcus, Arthur's assistant, was already checking the security monitor. It's Thomas, Marcus said. His voice tinged with concern. Arthur frowned. What does he want now? When the door opened, Thomas entered with his usual arrogance. There was something different about him. He seemed more aggressive. Almost furious. Arthur. We need to talk, Thomas said. Ignoring Maria. Arthur replied. Folding his arms. I'm listening. In private. You can say anything you have to say in front of her. Arthur said firmly. Oh. Now she's your confidant. Thomas sarcastically laughed. Interesting. Considering what's at stake. Ignoring Maria. Arthur replied. Folding his arms. Folding my arms. Thomas repeated. Rolling his eyes. In private. You can say whatever you want to her in front of her. Oh. Now she's your confidant. Thomas sarcastically laughed. Interesting. Considering what's at stake. Maria frowned. Feeling her discomfort grow. What's going on? Arthur shot a cold glance at Thomas. Say what you came here to say. Thomas pulled a folder from inside his jacket and placed it on the table. Here's everything. Proof that your bet went too far. Maria froze. Bet? What bet? Arthur closed his. Maria frowned. Feeling more and more uncomfortable. What's going on? Arthur shot a cold glance at Thomas. Say what you came here to say. Thomas pulled a folder from inside his jacket and placed it on the table. Here's everything. Proof that your bet went too far. Maria froze. Bet? What bet? Arthur closed his eyes as if the weight of the moment were crushing him. He had known the truth would come out eventually. Not like this. Not so suddenly. Maria. Thomas began, his tone cruel. Arthur made a bet with us. He said he could marry someone like you, a woman completely outside his world, and keep you by his side for 3 months. It was all a game to him. You were just a piece on his chessboard. The silence that followed was devastating. Maria looked at Arthur, waiting for him to deny it. To say Thomas was lying. But he said nothing. "Arthur," she asked, her voice breaking. Arthur tried to speak. Maria frowned, feeling upset. "What's going on?" Arthur shot a cold look at Thomas. "Say what you came here to say." Thomas pulled a folder from inside his jacket and placed it on the table. "Here's everything. Proof that your bet went too far." Maria froze. "Bet? What bet?" Arthur closed his mouth. The words died in his throat. She stepped back, feeling as though the ground beneath her had vanished. So all of this was a lie. Every word. Every gesture. "It's not that simple," he said desperately. Maria laughed bitterly. There was no joy in her laughter. "Not simple. You played with my life. Arthur. You used me for some stupid bet." "Maria. Please listen to me," Arthur said, moving closer. "No," she shouted, stepping away. "I don't want to hear anything else. You're exactly the man I thought you were when I first met you, cold. Selfish. Incapable of caring about anyone but yourself. Thomas. I'm satisfied with the chaos." He had caused a commotion. He gave a condescending smile. "Well. I think my work here is done. Enjoy the evening." He left, leaving Maria and Arthur alone. Maria took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I can't stay here. Arthur. Not after this. Not after what? I truly care about you." She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "If you cared, you never would have done this." Without waiting for a response, Maria went upstairs and began packing her things. Arthur remained in the room, feeling utterly defeated. The first time in his life, he realized he had lost something money couldn't buy. Maria left the mansion that night, refusing Arthur's offer to drive her. She didn't know where she was going. She knew she needed to leave. She couldn't ignore the pain of his betrayal. As the rideshare car took her away, Maria stared at the city lights, trying to. Maria frowned, feeling uneasy. "What's going on?" Arthur shot a cold glance at Thomas. "Say what you came here to say." Thomas pulled a folder from inside his jacket and placed it on the table. "Here's everything. Proof that your bet went too far." Maria froze. "Bet? What bet?" Arthur closed his eyes, trying to find a way back to himself. Meanwhile, he stayed alone in his study, staring into the emptiness. He knew he had made the greatest mistake of his life. Now all he could do was face the consequences. Maria spent the following weeks away from the Montero mansion. Staying in a modest boarding, Maria frowned, feeling more and more uncomfortable. "What's going on?" Arthur shot a cold glance at Thomas. "Say what you came here to say." Thomas pulled a folder from inside his jacket and placed it on the table. "Here's everything. Proof that your bet went too far." Maria froze. "Bet? What bet?" Arthur closed his house on the outskirts of the city. She used part of the money Arthur had given her to rent a small room and began looking for work. The void left by his betrayal was hard to ignore. Maria knew she had to move forward. Arthur, on the other hand, felt the weight of her absence. The mansion, once full of life during the months Maria had been there, now seemed cold and lifeless. He spent his nights secluded in his office, staring at the folder and the contract that had started it all. One afternoon, Marcos's assistant entered the office holding a piece of paper. "Mr. Montero," he said hesitantly, "I've found Mrs. Maria." Arthur looked up, surprised. He had asked Marcos to find out where she was. Wasn't sure if she would ever let him approach her again. "Is she all right?" he asked, his voice softer than he had intended. Marcos's assistant entered the office holding a piece of paper. "Mr. Montero," he said hesitantly, "I've found Mrs. Maria." Arthur looked up, surprised. He had asked Marcos to find out where she was. Wasn't sure if she would ever let him approach her again. "Is she all right?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "She's working as a waitress at a cafe downtown," Marcos replied. Arthur remained silent for a moment, processing the information. He knew he had to see her. Also knew he couldn't just show up without something meaningful to say. "Get the car ready," he said at last. Maria was wiping down a table in the small cafe where she had started working. When she heard the bell above the door chime, she didn't pay much attention, used to the regular customers. Until she heard a familiar voice, "Maria," she turned and saw Arthur standing there, looking perfect but with a strange look she had never seen before. "Arthur," she said, surprised and cautious. She asked, "What are you doing here?" He stepped forward. He kept a respectful distance. "That I need to talk to you. There's nothing for us to talk about," she replied, turning back to the table she was cleaning. "Please. Just give me 5 minutes," he said, almost pleading. Maria stopped and looked at him. There was something different. "What are you doing here?" he said, surprised and wary. "I needed to talk to you," he replied. "There's nothing for us to talk about," she replied, turning back to the table she was cleaning. "Please. Just give me 5 minutes," he said, almost pleading. Maria stopped and looked at him. There was something different about his posture. More humble. Against her better judgment. She nodded. 5 minutes, she said, motioning to an empty table. Arthur sat down while Maria remained standing, arms crossed. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," he began softly. "And I know what I did was unforgivable," she said firmly. "Then why are you here?" she asked. "Because I realized you deserved so much more than I gave you. I want to make things right if you'll let me." Maria let out a bitter laugh. "Make things right? Arthur. You turned my life into a game. You used me to feed your ego. How exactly do you plan to fix that?" Arthur took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. I gave the money from the bet back. Every penny. That I don't want any of it tied to what happened between us." Maria looked at him, surprised. "You did that?" "Yes. I know that doesn't erase what I did to you. That I just want you to know that I regret it deeply." She was silent for a moment, thinking about his words. "And what do you want from me now, Arthur?" she finally asked. "I want a chance to prove I can be different," he said sincerely, "not as part of a game. Because I care about you." Maria felt her heart tighten. She wanted to believe him. The fear of being hurt lingered. "That I need time," she said, her voice trembling. Arthur nodded, respecting her decision. "I'll wait as long as." Clara was surprised by Maria's newfound humility. She had known Arthur for years. She was shocked by how dedicated he had become. Arthur had started participating in social projects, which Maria had mentioned during their conversations at the mansion. He got directly involved, visiting underserved communities and listening to the stories of people facing struggles similar to Maria's past. Meanwhile, Maria continued working at the cafe, trying to reorganize her life. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about Arthur. His words at the cafe echoed in her mind. She began to wonder if he had truly changed. One day, while shopping at the market, Maria ran into Clara. Maria was surprised to see him. She had not expected him to come. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I'm visiting a social project in the neighborhood," Clara replied. "Arthur has been coordinating some amazing initiatives here. He's really dedicated." Maria was taken aback. She knew Arthur. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I'm here because of the stylist who worked with me at the mansion." "What a surprise," Clara said warmly, hugging her. "Maria, what are you doing here?" "Oh, I'm visiting a social project in the neighborhood. Arthur has been coordinating some amazing initiatives here. He's really dedicated." Maria had a different opinion about his posture. She nodded her head to show that she agreed. She had decided that it would be better to go to the empty table. Arthur sat down while Maria remained standing, arms crossed. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," he began softly. "And I know what I did was unforgivable." "Then why are you here?" she asked firmly. "Because I had the money to support any cause. I never imagined him getting personally involved." "Was he here today?" Maria asked, trying to hide her curiosity. "Yes. You should see him. He's not the same man he used to be." Maria's mind lingered on the words Clara had said as she walked home. She felt that it might be time to hear Arthur out. The next morning, Maria decided to go to the mansion. She felt a mix of nervousness and determination as she walked through the gate. Arthur was in the garden, talking with a group of children participating in an educational project. He seemed different, more relaxed, more human. When he saw her, he froze for a moment before walking toward her. "Maria," he said with a hesitant smile, "I wasn't expecting to see you here. I needed to see for myself," she replied, glancing around. "Clara told me about the projects you've been doing." Arthur nodded, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "You were the one who inspired me, Maria." I realized I had never used. Maria looked at Arthur, who was sitting down on an empty table. She had told him that she didn't want him to come. He came anyway. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," he said. "And I know what I did was unforgivable. But why are you here?" "Because," she said, "my power for anything truly meaningful was taken away until I met you." She looked at him for a moment, trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. "You've really changed, haven't you?" she asked. "I'm trying," he said. "And I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Maria took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Maria was unsure if she could forget what happened. She was willing to forgive Arthur. His eyes lit up. That's all he could ask for. Their meeting in the garden reignited a spark between Maria and Arthur. They both knew the path to rebuilding their relationship would be long and filled with uncertainties. After the conversation, Maria accepted Arthur's invitation to have lunch at the mansion, which was a small step toward feeling normal again. During lunch, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Maria, who'd once been hesitant and guarded, seemed more at ease. While Arthur showed a vulnerable and attentive side she had never seen before. "I saw the children in the garden," Maria said, breaking the silence. "You're really involved in these projects, aren't you?" Arthur nodded, placing his napkin beside his plate. "Yes. The first time. Using my money for something meaningful makes me feel human, and I owe that to you." Maria tilted her head, intrigued. "Yes," he replied with a smile. Maria looked at Arthur. "You're really involved in these projects, aren't you?" she said. "Yes," he replied. "Using my money for something meaningful makes me feel human. I owe that to you. You made me realize how disconnected I was from reality," he said. "Your stories, your strength, they made me question who I was and what I was doing with my life." Maria felt a tightness in her chest. Arthur's words sounded sincere, she thought. But the fear of trusting again still lingered. "Arthur," she began, carefully choosing her words. "It's..." Maria felt a tightness in her chest. Arthur's words sounded sincere. She was still afraid of trusting him. "It's not enough to say you've changed. Actions are what truly matter." "I know," he said without hesitation. "That's why I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show you that I'm a different man." In the days that followed, Maria began accompanying Arthur to his social projects. He invited her to visit a community school being renovated. He had donated money for the project. Maria hesitated at first, eventually agreed to visit. She was curious to see how he would act in such an unfamiliar environment. When they arrived at the school, Arthur was greeted warmly by children and volunteers that he seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and the challenges faced by the community. Maria was impressed to see him interacting with a natural ease she hadn't expected. "You're doing well," Maria said, watching Arthur talk with a teacher about the school's needs. He turned to her with a calm smile. "I didn't realize how much this would mean to me. I never thought helping others could be so rewarding." "Maria," he smiled back, feeling a growing connection to her. For the first time, she began to believe that Arthur's change was real, despite their progress. Maria still needed time to process everything that had happened. She decided it would be best to maintain some distance while she sorted out her feelings. "I need to get back to the..." Maria hesitated, eventually agreed to the plan. She was curious to see how he would act in such an unfamiliar environment. When they arrived at the school, Arthur was greeted warmly by the children and volunteers. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and the challenges faced by the community. "Cafe," she said one morning as they had breakfast in the mansion. Arthur frowned, clearly disappointed. He respected her decision. "If that's what you need, I understand." "Thank you," Maria said softly. "But that doesn't mean I don't see what you're doing. I just need a little more time." Arthur nodded, knowing he couldn't rush things. "I'll wait as long as it takes." As Maria returned to her routine at the cafe, Arthur continued working on his projects. He spent hours in meetings with nonprofits, community leaders, volunteers, trying to make up for the years he had ignored the world around him. During one of these meetings, Clara, who was Arthur, was involved in the projects. He was wearing casual clothes. He carried a bag full of books. Maria was surprised. Maria was curious to see how Arthur would act in such an unfamiliar environment. When they arrived at the school, Arthur was greeted warmly by children and volunteers. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and the challenges faced by the community. also involved in the projects, approached him. "You've changed," Clara said with a smile. "Arthur. Maria would be proud of what you're doing." Arthur offered a modest smile. "I just hope she sees it one day," Clara said, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Maria isn't someone who's easily swayed by. Trust her timing. Words alone." Arthur said. "You're showing her you're capable of more." He nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, as Maria was serving customers at the cafe, a group of children came running in, followed by Arthur. He was dressed casually. Something rare. Carried a bag full of books. Maria approached him, surprised. Maria was curious. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't know how she would feel. She didn't know how she would act. She didn't know how she would respond. Maria looked at Arthur. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was anxious. She saw that he was afraid. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was afraid. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She saw that he was scared. She saw that he was nervous. She saw that he was worried. She felt a mix of emotions. She knew she was beginning to trust him again. She was still afraid, that evening. Maria closed the cafe. She found an envelope on the counter. Inside was a letter from Arthur that I know words can't undo what I've done. I hope they can at. Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she read the letter. She knew there was still a long road ahead. For the first time, she felt she could give him a second chance. The sun shone. Arthur was greeted warmly by children and volunteers when they arrived at the school. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and the challenges faced by the community. Before I met you, I lived in a hollow world, surrounded by things that never truly meant anything. You showed me that there's more to life than money and power. For that, I'll always be grateful. I know that regaining your trust will take time. I'm willing to wait. Not because. Maria hesitated. Eventually agreed to meet with Arthur. She was curious to see how he would act in such an unfamiliar environment. When they arrived at the school, Arthur was greeted warmly by children and volunteers. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and the challenges faced by the community. It's part of a game or a challenge. Because you're the only person who's ever made me want to be a better man. With affection. Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she read the letter. She knew there was still a long road ahead. For the first time, she felt she could give him a second chance. The sun shone. Maria was curious to see how Arthur would act in a place he hadn't been to before. She set the cafe tables that morning, thinking about how her life had changed since she left the Montero mansion. It had been 3 months. Although she had rebuilt part of her routine, something still felt incomplete. Then she heard the doorbell ring. Looking up, she saw Arthur standing there, dressed simply, with a look she had never seen before. A mix of nervousness and hope. Arthur said, surprised. What are you doing here? He took a step forward, hesitating before speaking. I needed to see you. Maria. I have to say something. I can't keep it inside anymore. She crossed her arms, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had built up around her. We said everything there was to say. Maybe not. But I couldn't let you walk out of my life without trying again. Without telling you how much you changed who I am. Maria took a deep breath and placed the cloth she was holding on the counter. And what exactly do you? What do you want from me now? Another chance to prove you can win at anything? No. He said quickly. I never want to hurt you again. I just want you to know that the man you met during that stupid contract is gone. You showed me that life is about so much more than power or money. I'm here because I want to be a man worthy of you. Arthur. Another chance to prove you can win at anything? No. Then what do you want? Maria. I just want you to know that the man you met during that stupid contract is gone. You showed me that life is about so much more than power or money, you. Maria's heart raced. She kept her composure. His words sounded sincere. The wounds of betrayal weren't fully healed. Have you really changed? She asked in almost a whisper. I'm trying, he said firmly. And all I want is a chance to show you. Not with words. With actions. Maria remained silent. Searching. Maria's heart raced. She kept her composure. His words sounded sincere. She knew he hadn't fully healed from the wounds of betrayal. Have you really changed? She asked. Her voice barely audible. I'm trying. He replied firmly. All I want is a chance to show you. Not with words. With actions. Maria remained silent, searching his eyes for sincerity. Finally, she said, change takes time. Arthur. Does forgiveness. I know. He replied with a faint smile. And I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. The weeks that followed were filled with encounters between Maria and Arthur. He took her to see the social projects he had started, while she invited him to visit her. To see her world at the cafe. Gradually, Maria began to notice that the man by her side was different from the one she had met months ago. One day, Arthur invited her to a charity event in an underserved neighborhood where he had been working. Maria accepted, curious to see how he behaved in those settings. During the event, as Arthur spoke about the changes being implemented in the community. He looked directly at Maria in the audience and smiled after his speech. He approached her and extended his hand. "Come with me, that I want to show you something." Arthur led her back to the mansion. Specifically to the garden, where so many important conversations had taken place, but this time the place was transformed. The garden was illuminated by rows of lights hanging from the trees. A path of flower petals led to an arch decorated with white and red roses. Under the arch, a small table with 2 chairs was set, complete with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses waiting for. Maria was speechless as she took in the scene. Arthur said, "What is this?" "Something I needed to do." He guided her down the path. When they reached the arch, Arthur held her hands firmly. "Maria, you've changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. Before you, I was an empty man obsessed with control and success. You showed me what truly matters: people, connections, love." Maria's eyes filled with tears. She let him continue. "I know our beginning was wrong. I can't change the past. What I can do is promise you a better future if you'll let me." Arthur released her hands for a moment and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. He slowly knelt down, looking at her with a very vulnerable expression. "Maria," he began, his voice trembling, "that I don't want you to be my wife because of a contract or a bet. That I want you to be my wife because I love you. That I want to build a life with you based on respect, trust, true love. Will you marry me?" After a long period of uncertainty, Arthur finally agreed to wait for Maria. During this time, they spent a lot of time together. He introduced her to the social projects he had started. Maria was overwhelmed. She felt a mix of emotions. She was sad about the past. She also felt hopeful for the future. As she looked at Arthur, she saw sincerity, regret, love. "Yes, Arthur," she said, her voice shaking. "I accept." Arthur's face lit up with a radiant smile. Smile as he put the ring on her finger. That he stood up, pulling her into a tight hug. The two of them stayed there under the lights and the flower arch as if the world around them had disappeared. The ceremony took place 2 months later in the same garden. This time the setting was even more beautiful. Decorated. Maria and Arthur spent time together. She invited him to visit social projects she had started. She wore a white dress with delicate embroidery and her hair was styled in an elegant bun with small white flowers woven through it. Arthur stood at the altar, his eyes shining with emotion. As Maria walked down the aisle, the promise of a new beginning. The guests, friends, volunteers, people who had become significant in both their lives watched in silence, moved by the union that was finally happening in a genuine way. During the vows, Arthur held Maria's hands and said, "Maria, you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. I promise to love you, respect you, stand by your side through every moment, good or bad. Thank you for giving me the chance to become a better man." With tears in her eyes, Maria replied, "Arthur, you've shown me that people can change. That true love requires courage. I promise to walk by your side always as we build our life together." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, they kissed. The crowd clapped and threw petals into the air. The reception had music, laughter, dancing. Arthur and Maria held hands and enjoyed every moment. They knew they had overcome the past and were ready to build a future together. What do you think? Did Maria do the right thing by forgiving and marrying Arthur? Share your opinion in the comments below. Don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell to stay updated on our stories. Click here on the end screen to see more emotional stories.